The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, casting golden rays across the marble floors. Sarah Mitchell, a young palace curator, walked briskly through the corridors with her clipboard pressed against her chest. Her shoes clicked softly on the polished floor as she made her way to the royal vault, where centuries of treasures were kept under careful watch. Sarah had worked at the palace for 3 years, but she never got used to the weight of history that surrounded her every day. Today was different, though. Today she was conducting the annual inventory of Queen Elizabeth's personal jewelry collection, a task that required absolute precision and discretion. As she descended the stone staircase leading to the vault, her supervisor, Mr. Harrison, an elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair, joined her. He had been working at the palace for over 40 years and knew every corner, every secret, every tradition. Together they approached the heavy steel door that protected the royal treasures. The vault opened with a deep mechanical sound that echoed through the underground chamber. Inside, glass cases lined the walls, each containing pieces that had been worn by queens and princesses throughout British history. Diamond tiaras sparkled under the soft lights, emerald necklaces rested on velvet cushions, and pearl strands lay coiled like sleeping serpents. Sarah began her work methodically, checking each item against her list. Everything seemed in order until she reached the section dedicated to Queen Elizabeth's most personal pieces. These weren't the crown jewels that tourists came to see. These were the private collection, gifts from family members, pieces worn on intimate occasions, jewelry with deep emotional value. Her pen froze over her clipboard. A sick feeling spread through her stomach. 3 pieces were missing. Not just any pieces, but items that held extraordinary sentimental value. There was the sapphire brooch that Prince Philip had given the Queen on their 25th wedding anniversary. There was a delicate diamond bracelet that had belonged to Queen Victoria. And most significantly, there was the rose gold locket containing photographs of the Queen's parents, something she had cherished above almost any other possession. Sarah's hands began to tremble. She checked the list again, hoping she had made a mistake. She looked in the neighboring cases, thinking perhaps they had been moved during a previous cleaning. But there was no mistake. The pieces were gone. Mr. Harrison noticed her distress immediately. He came to her side and looked at what she was checking. His face, usually calm and composed, turned pale. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The implications were terrifying. A theft from the royal vault was not just a crime. It was a scandal that could shake the very foundations of the monarchy. They spent the next hour searching everywhere, pulling out drawers, checking maintenance records, looking at security logs. The security footage showed nothing unusual. The door had only been opened during scheduled times by authorized personnel. There had been no break-in, no forced entry, no suspicious activity. This meant only one thing. Whoever took the jewelry had legitimate access to the vault. It was an inside job. The palace was immediately put on lockdown. No one could leave or enter without special permission. The royal protection officers began a discreet investigation. They couldn't let word of this leak to the press. The scandal would be enormous. Over the next few days, every staff member who had access to the vault was questioned. Sarah found herself being interviewed 3 times, each session more intense than the last. She understood why. She had discovered the theft, which could make her a suspect. But she had nothing to hide, and eventually the investigators moved on to others. The palace felt different during those days. The usually cheerful staff moved through the halls with worried faces. Whispered conversations stopped when others approached. Trust, which had always been the foundation of palace life, began to crack. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, something unexpected happened. One of the junior housekeepers, a young woman named Emma, came forward with information. She had been cleaning in the private apartments 2 weeks earlier when she saw something strange. She had entered a room she thought was empty and found someone standing near an open jewelry box. That someone was Camilla, the queen consort. Emma had apologized and backed out of the room immediately, thinking nothing of it at the time. After all, Camilla had every right to be in the royal apartments. But now, with the investigation ongoing, the memory troubled her. She hadn't wanted to say anything because she feared she might be accusing an innocent person or getting herself into trouble. The investigators listened to Emma's account with serious faces. They asked her detailed questions about what she had seen, what time it was, which room it had been. Emma answered as best as she could, her voice shaking with nervousness. The lead investigator, Detective Chief Inspector Williams, a woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for solving difficult cases, made a decision. They needed to speak with Camilla. But this wasn't like questioning a staff member. This was the Queen Consort. The situation required extreme delicacy. Williams approached the palace's most senior official, Sir Edward Whitmore, the Lord Chamberlain. He was responsible for the overall organization of the royal household. When she explained the situation, his face showed a mixture of disbelief and horror. A meeting was arranged for the following day. It would be presented as a routine security briefing, nothing more. They couldn't risk alarming Camilla or causing her to become defensive. The truth needed to emerge naturally, carefully. Sarah continued her regular duties, but her mind was consumed by the mystery. She had grown up admiring the royal family, seeing them as symbols of stability and tradition. The thought that someone within that circle could have stolen from the Queen felt like a betrayal of everything the monarchy stood for. The night before the meeting with Camilla, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her small apartment staring at the ceiling, wondering what would happen next. Would they find the jewelry? Would there be an arrest? How could this be handled without destroying the reputation of the royal family? Little did she know that the next day would bring revelations that would change her understanding of the situation completely. The truth was far more complicated and far more human than anyone could have imagined. And it would reveal that sometimes the most shocking discoveries are not about crime, but about love, loss, and the desperate measures people take to hold onto memories of those they have loved. The formal sitting room in the private wing of Buckingham Palace was prepared with meticulous care. Fresh flowers sat in crystal vases, and the morning light streamed through the windows, making the room feel warm and welcoming. This was intentional. Detective Chief Inspector Williams wanted Camilla to feel comfortable, not threatened. When Camilla entered the room, she looked elegant as always, wearing a simple navy dress with pearl earrings. Her expression was curious but relaxed. She had no idea what this meeting was truly about. Sir Edward Whitmore and Williams stood to greet her, offering tea and making small talk about the weather. After a few minutes of pleasantries, Williams gently steered the conversation toward the real purpose of the meeting. She explained that there had been a routine inventory check of the royal jewelry collection, and some inconsistencies had been discovered. She watched Camilla's face carefully as she spoke. Camilla's expression didn't change much at first. She nodded, sipping her tea, seemingly unconcerned. But when Williams mentioned the specific pieces that were missing, something shifted. Camilla's hand holding the teacup trembled slightly. She set it down on the saucer with a soft clink. There was a long silence. Williams waited patiently. Years of experience had taught her that silence often brought out the truth more effectively than questions. Finally, Camilla spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. She asked if they could speak privately, just the two of them. Sir Edward looked uncertain, but Williams agreed. She sensed they were on the edge of something important. Once they were alone, Camilla walked to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the palace gardens. When she turned back, her eyes were filled with tears. She asked Williams if she would understand something about loss, about grief, about the desperate need to feel close to someone who was gone. Williams, who had lost her own mother just 2 years earlier, nodded. She understood more than Camilla might have expected. What Camilla revealed next was something no one had anticipated. She admitted that yes, she had taken the jewelry. But it wasn't theft in the way anyone imagined. It was something far more complicated, something that came from a place of deep emotional pain. Camilla explained that her relationship with Queen Elizabeth had been complex for many years. When she first married Charles, there had been tension, distance, coldness. The public knew this. What they didn't know was how much that had changed in the final years of the Queen's life. In those last months before Queen Elizabeth passed away, something beautiful had developed between them. They had spent quiet afternoons together, drinking tea, talking about life, about family, about the burdens and joys of royal duty. The Queen had shared stories about Philip, about her parents, about the weight of the crown. One particular afternoon stood out in Camilla's memory. The Queen had been especially reflective, talking about mortality and legacy. She had shown Camilla some of her most treasured pieces of jewelry, explaining the story behind each one. The sapphire brooch from Philip, the Victorian bracelet, the locket with her parents' photographs. The Queen had held that locket in her aged hands and told Camilla about how much she missed her mother and father, even after all these decades. She said that the locket helped her feel connected to them, especially on difficult days. She would hold it and remember their voices, their wisdom, their love. Camilla had been deeply moved by this moment of vulnerability. For the first time, she felt truly accepted, truly seen by the woman who would have been her mother-in-law. It was a moment of genuine connection that she had cherished. Then the Queen passed away. The grief that swept through the palace and the nation was profound. But for Camilla, there was an additional layer of loss. She had lost not just a queen, but a woman who had finally become something like a friend, perhaps even something like a mother figure. In the weeks following the funeral, Camilla found herself struggling. The transition to her new role as queen consort was overwhelming. The public scrutiny intensified. The pressure was enormous, and she found herself desperately missing those quiet conversations with Elizabeth, those moments of understanding and acceptance. One night, unable to sleep, she had wandered through the palace halls. Almost without thinking, she found herself near the vault. She knew the codes because as queen consort she had legitimate access. She told herself she just wanted to see the pieces again, to remember that afternoon, to feel close to Elizabeth one more time. But once she was there, looking at those pieces that Elizabeth had held and cherished, something came over her. She needed to be closer to that memory. She needed something tangible to hold on to. Before she fully realized what she was doing, she had taken the 3 pieces that Elizabeth had shown her that day, the ones with the deepest emotional significance. She had kept them in her private chambers, hidden away. Sometimes, when the pressure became too much, she would take them out and hold them, especially the locket. She would open it and look at the photographs of the king and queen mother, and she would remember Elizabeth's voice telling stories about them. It made her feel less alone. Camilla looked at Williams with red eyes. She knew it was wrong. She knew she had no right to take them, regardless of her position or her grief. But in that moment of overwhelming loss, she hadn't been thinking clearly. She had just needed something to hold on to. Williams sat quietly, absorbing this confession. This wasn't the story of a thief seeking material gain. This was the story of a grieving woman who had made a desperate choice in a moment of pain. It didn't make it right, but it made it understandable. She asked Camilla where the pieces were now. Camilla said they were in a locked drawer in her private sitting room. She had wrapped them carefully in silk, the way Elizabeth might have. She had taken care of them, treasuring them as Elizabeth had done. Williams faced a difficult decision. Technically, this was theft from the royal collection. But the person who had taken them was the queen consort. The person they had been stolen from was no longer alive. And the motive was grief, not greed. She told Camilla that the jewelry would need to be returned immediately to the vault. Camilla nodded, expecting this. But Williams added something else. She suggested that perhaps there was another way to honor Elizabeth's memory, a way that didn't involve keeping what wasn't hers to keep. Camilla wiped her eyes and asked what she meant. Williams said they would discuss it, but first they needed to retrieve the pieces and return them safely. Camilla agreed without hesitation. Together they walked through the palace to Camilla's private chambers. The pieces were exactly where she said they would be, wrapped carefully, clearly treated with reverence. Williams examined them. They were undamaged, perfectly preserved. As they walked back toward the vault, Camilla asked Williams what would happen next. Would there be charges? Would this become public? Williams said she needed to consult with Sir Edward and others, but she believed there might be a path forward that honored both justice and compassion. The revelation had been shocking, but it had also been deeply human. And in that humanity there might be room for understanding, for mercy, and for healing. The emergency meeting took place in Sir Edward Whitmore's private office, a room lined with leather-bound books and portraits of previous monarchs. Present were Sir Edward, Detective Chief Inspector Williams, the palace's Chief Legal Counsel Margaret Thornberry, and the King's private secretary. James Pemberton Williams began by explaining what Camilla had confessed. She chose her words carefully, presenting the facts while also conveying the emotional context that had led to Camilla's actions. As she spoke, she watched the reactions around the room. Sir Edward's face was grave but thoughtful. Margaret Thornberry took notes with a steady hand, her legal mind already working through the implications. James Pemberton looked deeply troubled, clearly thinking about how this would affect the king. When Williams finished, silence filled the room. Finally, Margaret spoke. From a purely legal standpoint, she explained, this was theft from the royal collection. The fact that Camilla was queen consort didn't exempt her from the law. However, she also acknowledged that prosecuting the queen consort would create a constitutional crisis, unlike anything Britain had seen in modern times. Sir Edward leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had served the monarchy through various scandals and challenges, but nothing quite like this. The question wasn't just about law, he said. It was about the monarchy itself, about public trust, about family, and about how to handle a situation that was both a transgression and a cry of grief. James Pemberton raised a crucial point. The king needed to be informed immediately. This involved his wife, his mother's memory, and potentially the reputation of the entire institution he now led. They couldn't make any decisions without consulting him. Williams agreed, but suggested they have a clear recommendation ready. The king would be looking to them for guidance on how to handle this unprecedented situation. Margaret proposed several options. They could pursue criminal charges, which would be devastating but legally correct. They could handle it as an internal disciplinary matter, though it was unclear what that would even mean for a queen consort. Or they could find a way to address the wrong, while also acknowledging the grief that motivated it. Sir Edward asked Williams for her professional opinion. She had seen Camilla's remorse, heard her confession, witnessed her pain. What did Williams think should happen? Williams took a moment before responding. She said that in her years as a detective, she had learned to distinguish between people who broke the law for selfish reasons and those who made terrible choices while drowning in emotion. Camilla fell into the latter category. She wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. She was a grieving woman who had made a profoundly wrong decision. However, Williams continued, that didn't mean there should be no consequences. Justice required acknowledgement of wrongdoing and some form of accountability, but perhaps justice could be served in a way that also allowed for healing and growth. She suggested a path that was unusual but might work. Camilla should write a formal letter to the king, acknowledging what she had done and why. The letter would be placed in the royal archives, creating a historical record. Camilla would also need to make a meaningful gesture that honored Queen Elizabeth's memory in a legitimate way. Additionally, Williams proposed that Camilla should spend time with the palace's history curator, learning about the proper stewardship of royal treasures. It would be educational but also symbolic, a recognition that these pieces belonged not to individuals but to history itself. Margaret considered this carefully. It wasn't a traditional legal resolution, but it might serve justice in a deeper way. It would acknowledge the wrong, require accountability, and create positive action moving forward. James said he would present this recommendation to the king, but wanted to prepare him for the emotional weight of the conversation. This wasn't just about protocol. It was about his wife, his late mother, and the complex emotions that connected them all. The meeting ended with a plan. James would speak with the king that evening. Depending on his response, they would move forward with the proposed solution or reconvene to consider alternatives. That night, in the king's private study, James sat across from Charles and explained everything. The king's reaction was complex. There was shock at what Camilla had done. There was pain at the thought of his mother's treasures being taken. But there was also understanding. Charles knew better than anyone the complicated relationship his wife and mother had shared. He had witnessed the tension of the early years and the beautiful transformation that occurred near the end of his mother's life. He knew how much those final months of acceptance had meant to Camilla. He also knew his wife. He knew her capacity for love, her struggles with public perception, her deep need to be accepted by the institution she had married into. When his mother died, he had been so consumed with his own grief and his new responsibilities as king that he hadn't fully recognized how much Camilla was struggling. Charles sat in silence for a long time, looking at a photograph of his mother that sat on his desk. Finally, he spoke. He said that his mother had believed in mercy alongside justice. She had understood that people were complex, that mistakes didn't define a person's entire character. He wanted to speak with Camilla himself before any decisions were made. James arranged for them to meet the following morning in the private garden, a place where they could talk without the weight of the palace walls around them. The next morning, under a sky streaked with dawn colors, Charles and Camilla walked together along the garden paths. Palace staff had been instructed to give them complete privacy. What was said between them remained between them as it should be. But those who saw them return to the palace noticed something. They were holding hands, and Camilla's eyes, though red from crying, held a look of relief. Charles's expression was serious but not angry. Whatever had been said, whatever understanding had been reached, seemed to have brought them closer rather than driving them apart. Later that day, Charles met again with his advisors. He had made his decision. He wanted to follow the path that Williams had suggested, with one addition. He wanted to create a new tradition in his mother's honor, something that would involve Camilla and would channel her grief into something positive. The details would need to be worked out, but the foundation was set. There would be acknowledgement of wrong, accountability, and a path toward healing. It wasn't a perfect solution, but then again, human situations rarely had perfect solutions. What mattered was that it honored multiple truths at once: the seriousness of what had been done, the grief that motivated it, the need for justice, and the possibility of redemption. In that balance, there was wisdom that Queen Elizabeth herself might have appreciated. 3 days after the garden conversation, Camilla sat at an antique writing desk in her private study. Before her lay a sheet of cream-colored paper embossed with the royal crest. Her hand held a fountain pen, but for several minutes she simply stared at the blank page. Writing this letter was one of the most difficult things she had ever had to do. It required her to put into words not just what she had done, but why she had done it, knowing that this letter would become part of the permanent royal archives. Future historians would read it. Future generations would judge her by it. She began to write. Her handwriting, usually so confident and flowing, was shaky at first. She addressed the letter to Charles, though she knew it was really for history itself. She explained how she had come to take the pieces, the emotional state she had been in, the desperation she had felt to maintain some connection to Elizabeth. She didn't make excuses. She acknowledged clearly that what she had done was wrong, regardless of her emotional state. The pieces weren't hers to take, no matter how much they meant to her, no matter how much she was grieving. She had betrayed the trust placed in her as queen consort and as someone with privileged access to the nation's treasures. But she also wrote about the transformation that had occurred between her and Elizabeth in those final months. She wanted that part of history recorded too. She wanted people to know that despite all the years of tension, despite all the public criticism, something beautiful had emerged. Two women who had every reason to remain distant had found genuine connection. She wrote about the specific afternoon when Elizabeth had shown her the jewelry, about the vulnerability in the Queen's voice when she spoke about missing her parents, about how that moment had meant everything to Camilla, because it represented full acceptance. The letter took her over 2 hours to write. When she finished, she read it through 3 times, making small corrections. Then she sealed it in an envelope and personally delivered it to Sir Edward's office. Meanwhile, preparations were underway for the second part of Camilla's accountability, her work with the palace curator. Sarah Mitchell had been chosen to guide Camilla through the history and proper care of the royal collection. When Sarah learned of her assignment, she felt a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. Their first meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the conservation room, where delicate restoration work was done on historical pieces. Sarah arrived early, setting out examples of various jewelry pieces along with their documentation files. When Camilla entered, Sarah immediately stood unsure of the proper protocol for this unusual situation. Camilla smiled gently and asked her to please sit. She wanted this to be a real learning experience, not a formal ceremony. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Camilla met 3 times a week. Sarah showed her how each piece was cataloged, how environmental conditions affected precious metals and gems, how decisions were made about which pieces could be worn and which were too fragile. She explained the historical significance of various items, the stories they told about the people who had worn them. Something unexpected happened during these sessions. Sarah, who had initially been intimidated, began to see Camilla as simply a person trying to understand and make amends. And Camilla, who had taken the session seriously from the start, found herself genuinely fascinated by the stories Sarah told. One afternoon, Sarah showed her a simple silver locket that had belonged to Queen Victoria. It wasn't valuable in monetary terms, nothing like the grand pieces tourists came to see, but Victoria had worn it every day for decades. Inside were tiny portraits of her children. Sarah explained how Victoria, after losing Prince Albert, had held on to anything that connected her to her loved ones. She had kept his rooms exactly as they were. She had worn mourning clothes for years. She had surrounded herself with photographs and mementos. It was, Sarah said gently, a kind of desperate attempt to keep the past alive. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, looking at the locket. Then she said softly that she understood Victoria perhaps better than she had ever expected to. Grief, she said, made people do things that might not make sense to others but felt absolutely necessary in the moment. Sarah, emboldened by Camilla's openness, asked if she could say something personal. Camilla nodded. Sarah said that when she first discovered the missing pieces, she had felt betrayed. The royal collection was something she had dedicated her career to protecting. But after learning the full story, after spending these weeks together, she understood that sometimes people's worst actions come from their deepest pain. Camilla's eyes filled with tears. She thanked Sarah for her honesty and her compassion. This experience, she said, had taught her something crucial about the responsibility she carried. These treasures weren't just beautiful objects. They were links to history, to the people who had worn them, to the stories that made the monarchy meaningful. As the educational sessions continued, Charles's addition to the plan began to take shape. He wanted to create something called the Queen Elizabeth Memorial Conservation Fellowship. It would be a program that brought young historians and conservators to work with the royal collection, learning the skills needed to preserve these treasures for future generations. Camilla would be the patron of this fellowship. She would meet with each fellow, hear about their work, support their learning. It would be her way of channeling her connection to Elizabeth into something that honored the Queen's legacy properly. The fellowship would begin with 5 positions, funded personally by Charles and Camilla. Sarah would help select the first fellows and design the curriculum. It would be rigorous and prestigious, attracting the best young talent in the field. When the plan was announced internally at the palace, the response was positive. Staff members who had been whispering about the theft investigation, who had noticed the tension in the air, suddenly saw a different story emerging. They didn't know the specific details of what had happened, but they could see that something meaningful was being built. Emma, the housekeeper who had reported seeing Camilla with the jewelry box, was called to a private meeting with Sir Edward. She had been terrified that she might lose her job for speaking up. Instead, Sir Edward thanked her for her courage and discretion. He explained that her report had led to a resolution that, while complicated, had ultimately been constructive. Emma was also told that her employment would never be in jeopardy for reporting concerns about the collection's safety. The palace needed staff members who took their responsibility seriously, who spoke up when something seemed wrong. As spring turned to summer, the various pieces of the plan came together. The letter was archived. The educational sessions were completed. The fellowship was announced to the public, though without any mention of its connection to the missing jewelry, which had been quietly returned to the vault. The public announcement described the fellowship as a tribute to Queen Elizabeth's lifelong commitment to preserving British heritage. Camilla spoke at the announcement ceremony about how much she had learned from the late Queen about the importance of history and tradition. Watching her speak, Charles felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in how she had faced her mistake, sadness about the pain that had led to it, gratitude that they had found a path through this crisis that honored both justice and mercy. The first 5 fellows were selected from over 200 applicants. They were brilliant young people, passionate about conservation and history. When they arrived at the palace for their orientation, Camilla met with each of them personally, asking about their backgrounds and their dreams for the future. One fellow, a young woman from Scotland named Fiona, mentioned that she had been inspired to pursue conservation after visiting the palace as a child and seeing Queen Elizabeth's jewelry on display. Camilla smiled and said that she hoped this fellowship, would help ensure that future children could have similar inspiring experiences. What had begun as a devastating discovery of missing treasures had transformed into something meaningful. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and the pain of what had happened would never fully disappear. But from that pain, something good had grown. 6 months after the fellowship was announced, Detective Chief Inspector Williams sat in a small cafe near Scotland Yard, reading the morning newspaper. There was a feature article about the Queen Elizabeth Memorial Conservation Fellowship, complete with photographs of the fellows at work and quotes from Camilla about the importance of preserving history. Williams smiled to herself, stirring sugar into her tea. The article made no mention of how the fellowship had truly come to be. That story remained locked away in confidential files and in the memories of those few people who knew the truth. She thought about how differently things could have gone. If Camilla had been less honest, less willing to face what she had done, the situation could have become a scandal that damaged the monarchy irreparably. If the advisors had been less compassionate, less willing to see the human being behind the title, justice might have been served in a way that was technically correct but ultimately destructive. Instead, they had found what Williams considered the most difficult path, the one that required everyone involved to think beyond simple categories of right and wrong, to hold multiple truths at once, to be both firm about accountability and open to understanding. Her phone rang. It was Sarah Mitchell. They had become friends during the investigation, bonding over their shared experience of being at the center of such an unusual situation. Sarah was calling to tell her about something that had happened that morning. One of the new conservation fellows, while working on cataloging some of Queen Victoria's personal items, had discovered a hidden compartment in an old jewelry box. Inside were letters Victoria had written to Albert after his death, letters she had never sent because he was gone. The letters spoke of her grief, her loneliness, her struggle to carry on. Sarah's voice was emotional as she described reading these letters. They were heartbreaking, but also beautiful. Victoria had poured out her pain onto paper, creating a private conversation with someone who could never respond. Williams understood why Sarah had called to tell her this. These letters were another example of how grief made people reach for impossible connections. Victoria writing letters to a dead husband wasn't so different from Camilla taking jewelry to feel close to a lost friend. History, Williams reflected, wasn't just about kings and queens making grand decisions. It was also about human beings struggling with loss, making mistakes, trying to find ways to cope with impossible feelings. Meanwhile, at the palace, Camilla was preparing for an event that had become personally meaningful to her. Each month she hosted a tea for the conservation fellows, a chance for them to share their progress and challenges. What had started as part of her accountability had become something she genuinely looked forward to. Today's tea included a special guest, Margaret Thornberry, the legal counsel who had helped navigate the resolution of the jewelry situation. Margaret had taken an interest in the fellowship and had offered to give a talk about the legal frameworks that protected historical artifacts. As the fellows gathered in the sitting room, Camilla noticed how comfortable they had become around her. At first, they had been nervous and formal, but now they asked questions freely, debated points of conservation philosophy, and even gently disagreed with her when they thought she was wrong about something. Fiona, the fellow from Scotland, was presenting her research on the deterioration of antique textiles in the royal collection. She had discovered that several 18th century gowns were at risk and had developed a proposal for their preservation. Her passion for the work was evident in every word she spoke. Watching her, Camilla felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Pride. Not the pride of ownership or accomplishment, but the pride of having helped create something that would outlast any single person. These young people would go on to protect and preserve treasures for decades to come. They would pass their knowledge to the next generation, creating a chain of guardianship that stretched into the future. After the presentation, Margaret spoke about the legal responsibilities that came with caring for national treasures. She explained how the law saw these objects not as possessions, but as heritage held in trust for the people. Every generation had a duty to protect them and pass them on. As Margaret spoke, Camilla found herself thinking about that moment months ago when she had stood in the vault and taken what wasn't hers to take. She had understood intellectually that the jewelry belonged to the nation, but she hadn't truly felt the weight of what that meant. Now, after months of learning about conservation, about the stories embedded in these objects, about the generations of people who would need to see and learn from them, she understood differently. After the event, Camilla asked Margaret if they could speak privately. They walked together through the palace corridors to a small library room. Camilla wanted to thank Margaret for the way she had handled the legal aspects of the situation, for finding a path that served justice without being destructive. Margaret smiled and said that it had been one of the most challenging cases of her career, precisely because the law wasn't designed to handle such nuanced human situations. The law dealt in clear categories, but life rarely fit into those categories neatly. Camilla asked Margaret something she had been wondering about. Would this secret eventually come out? Would historians decades from now discover the truth? Margaret said it was possible. The letter Camilla had written was in the archives. The people who knew the truth would eventually pass away, but their records might remain. Future researchers might piece together the story from fragments and clues. But Margaret added that this didn't trouble her. The truth was more complex and more human than a simple scandal. If it did come out eventually, it would show that even people in the highest positions struggled with grief and made mistakes. It would also show that institutions could respond with both firmness and compassion. Camilla considered this. The idea that her worst moment might be known to history was uncomfortable. But perhaps Margaret was right. Perhaps knowing that even Queen's consort struggled with very human emotions and failures would make history feel more real, more accessible to ordinary people. That evening, Charles and Camilla had dinner together in their private dining room, something that had become more regular since the jewelry incident. The experience had changed their relationship in subtle ways. There was a deeper honesty between them now, a recognition that they both carried burdens and made mistakes. Charles told her about a meeting he had had that day with his private secretary. They had been reviewing the first 6 months of his reign, looking at what had gone well and what needed improvement. One thing that had clearly gone well was the Conservation Fellowship. It had received positive attention and was already inspiring other institutions to create similar programs. Camilla felt a warm glow at this news. Something that had emerged from her darkest moment was now being recognized as a positive contribution. It didn't erase what she had done, but it showed that people could grow and change, that mistakes could be transformed into opportunities for good. She told Charles about the letters that had been discovered in Queen Victoria's jewelry box, about how Victoria had written to Albert long after he was gone. Charles was quiet for a moment, then said that his own grandmother had done something similar after his grandfather died. She had kept a diary where she wrote entries addressed to him, telling him about her day, asking his advice on difficult decisions. These stories of grief and coping mechanisms seemed to run through the history of the royal family. Perhaps, Charles suggested, that was because the monarchy asked people to be public figures while dealing with private pain. They had to smile and wave and carry out duties even when their hearts were breaking. Camilla reached across the table and took his hand. They sat there in comfortable silence, two people who had learned that strength sometimes meant admitting weakness, that leadership sometimes meant acknowledging mistakes, and that the most important thing was not to be perfect but to be honest and to keep trying to do better. Outside the palace windows, London went about its evening routines. People headed home from work. Tourists took photographs of the palace gates, and life continued in its ordinary way. Inside, in rooms that had witnessed centuries of history, another chapter was being written, one that would remain mostly hidden but was no less real for its privacy. 1 year after the jewelry had been returned to the vault, Sarah Mitchell was promoted to senior curator of the royal collection. It was recognition of her work with the Conservation Fellowship and her dedication to protecting the nation's treasures. On her first day in her new role, she received an unexpected invitation. Camilla wanted to meet with her privately. Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness as she walked to the Queen Consort's study. Over the past year, they had developed a respectful working relationship, but this private invitation felt different, more personal. Camilla greeted her warmly and asked her to sit. On the table between them was a leather-bound journal. Camilla explained that she had been keeping this journal since the incident with the jewelry, writing in it whenever she felt overwhelmed by her responsibilities or her grief. She had written about her sessions with Sarah, about what she had learned, about how her understanding of the royal collection had deepened. She had also written about her continuing grief for Queen Elizabeth and how she had found healthier ways to process those feelings. Camilla said she wanted Sarah to have the journal, not for the archives, but as a personal gift. She wanted Sarah to know how much their time together had meant, how much Sarah's patience and knowledge had helped her through a difficult period. Sarah was moved to tears. She had gone into those teaching sessions feeling somewhat resentful, seeing them as a chore required by unusual circumstances. She had emerged from them with deep respect for Camilla's willingness to learn and change. They talked for over an hour, reflecting on the journey they had both been on. Sarah shared that the experience had taught her that the objects in her care weren't just artifacts. They were connected to living people with real emotions. Her job wasn't just to preserve metal and stone. It was to honor the human stories those objects represented. Camilla said that she still missed Queen Elizabeth every day. But she had learned that honoring someone's memory didn't mean holding on to their physical possessions. It meant living in a way that reflected the values they had taught you. Elizabeth had taught her about duty, about service, about the importance of protecting things for future generations. Before Sarah left, Camilla mentioned that she wanted to establish an annual lecture series as part of the Conservation Fellowship. Each year, someone who had made significant contributions to heritage preservation would be invited to speak. The first lecture would be given by Sarah if she would accept. Sarah agreed, honored and slightly overwhelmed. As she walked back to her office carrying the journal carefully, she thought about how strange life could be. A year ago, she had been the person who discovered a theft. Now she was receiving a deeply personal gift from the person who had committed that theft. It made no logical sense, and yet it felt right. That evening, Detective Chief Inspector Williams received a call from Sir Edward Whitmore. He rarely contacted her directly, so she knew it must be important. He asked if she could come to the palace the next day for a meeting. When Williams arrived, she was shown to a small conference room where Sir Edward, Margaret Thornbury, and James Pemberton were waiting. Sir Edward explained that they had been reviewing how various situations had been handled over the past year, looking for lessons that could improve palace procedures. The jewelry incident had revealed some weaknesses in their security protocols, but it had also revealed strengths in how people had responded. Sir Edward wanted Williams's perspective on what had worked well and what could be improved. Williams thought carefully before responding. She said that what had worked was the willingness to see beyond the immediate crime to the human circumstances surrounding it. That didn't mean excusing wrongdoing, but it meant responding in a way that was proportional and constructive. She also said that the palace's culture of discretion, while necessary for many reasons, could sometimes prevent people from seeking help when they were struggling. If there had been a way for Camilla to talk about her grief, to ask for support, perhaps she wouldn't have felt so desperate that taking the jewelry seemed like her only option. Margaret agreed and mentioned that she had been working on a proposal for a confidential counseling service for senior royal family members. The pressures they faced were unique and they needed specialized support. The jewelry incident had made clear that even those at the highest level struggled and needed someone to talk to. James added that they were also reviewing how the royal collection was managed. Not to restrict access, but to create better systems for tracking pieces and understanding who was viewing what and when. The goal was prevention rather than punishment. Sir Edward thanked Williams for her insights and for how she had handled the investigation. Her discretion and judgment had been invaluable. He also mentioned that the king wanted to recognize her service in some way, perhaps with a commendation. Williams was surprised but grateful. She said that the case had taught her things too. It had challenged her assumptions about justice and accountability. She had learned that sometimes the best resolution wasn't the most obvious one. Meanwhile, the first anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's death was approaching. The entire nation was preparing to mark the occasion with ceremonies and tributes. For Camilla, the date carried additional weight. It marked not just a year since Elizabeth's death, but a year since the actions that had led to the jewelry incident. She had been asked to give a speech at the main memorial service. Writing it was difficult. She wanted to honor Elizabeth's memory authentically while being mindful of her own complicated relationship with that memory. The night before the service, she showed the speech to Charles. He read it carefully, then looked at her with pride. The speech talked about Elizabeth's sense of duty, her dedication to service, her ability to adapt and grow. It also talked subtly about how Elizabeth had shown Camilla that it was never too late to build new relationships, to overcome old barriers, to find connection. The next day, Westminster Abbey was filled with dignitaries, family members, and ordinary citizens who had lined up for hours for a chance to attend. When Camilla stood at the podium, she felt the weight of all those eyes on her. But she also felt something else, a sense of peace about who she was and the journey she had been on. She delivered the speech with genuine emotion, her voice occasionally cracking but never breaking completely. She spoke about Elizabeth not as a distant icon, but as a woman who had been kind to her when she had no reason to be, who had shown her that grace was more powerful than grudges. After the service, as people filed out, many came to Camilla to thank her for her words. Some mentioned that they too had complicated relationships with family members who had passed away, that they understood the mix of grief and gratitude and regret she had expressed. An elderly woman, someone Camilla didn't recognize, took her hand and said simply, "She would have been proud of you." Camilla didn't know if that was true, but she wanted it to be. She wanted to live in a way that would have made Elizabeth proud, that honored the unexpected gift of acceptance Elizabeth had given her. That evening, back at the palace, Camilla visited the vault one final time. It was something she had asked permission to do, wanting to mark the anniversary in a private way. The vault manager accompanied her, unlocking the cases that held Elizabeth's personal jewelry. She stood before the case containing the sapphire brooch, the Victorian bracelet, and the locket with photographs of Elizabeth's parents. She didn't touch them. She didn't need to. Looking at them was enough. They were beautiful, precious, but they were where they belonged. She thought about how a year ago she had stood in this same spot and made a terrible choice. She had been drowning in grief and had reached for a lifeline that wasn't hers to take. Now standing here again, she felt grief still, but it was different. It was softer, more manageable, woven into the fabric of her daily life rather than overwhelming it. She whispered a few words to Elizabeth, a private conversation that no one else would ever hear. Then she thanked the vault manager and left. Walking back through the palace corridors, she passed portraits of previous kings and queens. Each of them had their own stories, their own struggles, their own moments of weakness and strength. The history of the monarchy wasn't just about grand ceremonies and political decisions. It was also about human beings trying to do their best while carrying impossible burdens. She thought about the conservation fellows who were learning to protect these treasures. She thought about Sarah and the journal she had given her. She thought about Charles and the partnership they had built through honesty and forgiveness. She thought about Detective Chief Inspector Williams and her willingness to see complexity rather than just crime. All of these people had been part of her journey from that dark moment of taking the jewelry to this moment of peace and acceptance. She hadn't traveled that path alone. She had been held accountable, yes, but she had also been held up by people who believed she could be better than her worst moment. As she reached her private chambers, she found Charles waiting for her. He had known she was going to the vault and wanted to be there when she returned. They sat together by the window, looking out at the palace gardens as evening fell. She told him that she was finally ready to let go completely, to stop defining herself by what she had done wrong and start